Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind was a living thing that night, a predator howling down from the frosted peaks of the granite mountains. It clawed at the log walls of my cabin, searching for any chink, any weakness to sink its icy teeth into. For 3 days it hadn't ceased trapping me in this 10 by 12-foot world I'd built with my own hands. Outside, the snow was piling into drifts taller than a man, burying the world I'd left behind even deeper. That suited me just fine. The world and I had come to a mutual, if unspoken, agreement years ago. It would leave me be, and I would do it the same courtesy. My name is Elias Thorne. If you were to ask the folks in the town of Redemption, a good 40 miles east, they'd probably tell you I was a ghost, a man who bought a remote plot of land after the war, built a cabin, and then simply vanished into the timber and the seasons. They wouldn't be far wrong. I'd seen enough of men and their ambitions in the mud and blood of Shiloh and Antietam to last 10 lifetimes. I came up here not to find something, but to lose something, to lose the man. I had been the one whose hands felt stained no matter how hard he scrubbed them, the one who saw the faces of the dead in his sleep, and most of all to forget the echoing silence left behind by my wife Sarah, taken by the fever while I was away playing soldier. This cabin, this solitude, was my penance and my peace. I was sitting at the rough-hewn pine table, my hands wrapped around a mug of chicory coffee that had long gone cold. The fire in the stone hearth crackled and spat a defiant little flicker of life against the vast frozen darkness. It was my only companion, and its language was one I understood. My rifle, a Winchester 73, leaned against the wall next to the door, always within arm's reach. It wasn't that I expected trouble. Out here you didn't expect trouble. You simply lived with the understanding that it was always a silent partner in the wilderness waiting for its moment. The day's chores were done. The woodpile was stocked high, the horses were fed and secure in the lean-to, and a haunch of venison was salted and hanging from the rafters. There was nothing left to do but sit and listen to the storm, to let the howl of the wind scour the thoughts from my head. I was thinking of Sarah, of the way her hair smelled like lavender in sunshine, a scent so out of place in my memory now up here in this world of pine and snow. It was a dull ache, a phantom limb of a life that was no longer mine. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the wind. I knew every groan of the logs, every rattle of the window pane. This was different. A soft, desperate thudding against the heavy oak door. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound so faint it was almost swallowed by the gale. My head snapped up, every nerve in my body suddenly screaming. My heart gave a single hard kick against my ribs. No one came up this high. No one could come up this high, not in a blizzard like this. A lost trapper would be holed up in a deadfall. A traveler would have had the sense to stay in town. My first thought was of a panther, or maybe a bear driven mad by hunger, but the sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of its legs loud in the sudden tension of the room. I moved slowly, deliberately, my stockinged feet making no sound on the floorboards. I listened, holding my breath, my ear turned toward the door. Nothing but the shriek of the wind. Had I imagined it? Was the loneliness finally gnawing away at the edges of my mind? Thump, thump. There it was again. Weaker this time. A sound of utter exhaustion. My hand went to the Winchester, the cold steel familiar and reassuring. I crossed the room in 3 silent strides, my shadow dancing in the firelight. Who in God's name could be out there? My mind raced through the grim possibilities. A wounded man. An outlaw on the run. A specter conjured by the storm itself. Part of me, the part that had walled itself off from the world, wanted to ignore it. Let the wilderness claim whatever it was. It was not my concern. My life was about having no concerns. But another part, a part I thought had died with Sarah, wouldn't let me. I couldn't let a dog die out there on a night like this, let alone a person. With a sigh that felt like it came from the soles of my feet, I rested the rifle against the wall and lifted the heavy iron bar that secured the door. The moment I pulled the door inward, the storm lunged into the room. A blast of wind and stinging snow stole the warmth and sent papers flying from my table. And in that maelstrom of white and cold she stood. Or rather, she swayed. For a second I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It was a human figure, but so battered by the elements, she seemed more a part of the storm than a person caught in it. She was barefoot. The sight of her bare feet, blue-white and caked with frozen mud on the snow-covered threshold, sent a jolt through me. She wore a single garment, a deerskin dress that was torn at the shoulder, and ragged at the hem, offering little protection against the brutal cold. Her black hair was a wild tangle laced with ice crystals that glittered in the firelight. She couldn't have been much older than 20. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp under skin stretched tight and pale, but it was her eyes that held me. They were dark, deep-set, and filled with a fierce hunted animal's terror. They weren't pleading. They were wary, assessing, ready to bolt at the slightest move. She was trembling violently, not just from cold, but from an exhaustion so profound it seemed to be the only thing holding her upright. I stood there, stunned into silence, the cold air burning my lungs. The wind whipped her thin dress against her body, revealing the frailness of her frame. She didn't speak. She just stared at me, her breath coming in ragged, steaming puffs. "You're lost," I finally managed to say, my voice a rough croak. It was the stupidest thing I could have said. She gave a single jerky shake of her head. Her gaze flickered past me into the warmth of the cabin, then back to my face. The sheer will keeping her on her feet was almost palpable. "You heard?" I asked. Another shake. She swayed again, and for a moment, I thought she would collapse right there. The decision wasn't even a decision. It was an instinct, a reflex against the sheer cruelty of letting her fall back into the storm's embrace. To send her away was to sentence her to death. I knew it with a certainty that chilled me more than the wind. I stepped back, pulling the door wide. "Get in," I said, my voice firmer this time. "Now." She hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes filled with a deep ingrained suspicion. I saw the conflict in them, the terror of the storm warring with the terror of a strange man in an isolated cabin. Then, with a staggering step, she crossed the threshold. She moved like a phantom, silent and uncertain, bringing the scent of ice and frozen pine with her. I slammed the door shut against the storm and dropped the iron bar back in place. The sudden silence was deafening. The cabin, my sanctuary, felt different now. Invaded, charged with a presence that was not my own. She stood just inside the door, not moving, not touching anything. The heat from the hearth washed over her, and I saw a fresh wave of shivers rack her body as her frozen muscles reacted to the warmth. She hugged herself, her gaze fixed on the flames as if it were a god. She looked even smaller inside, fragile and out of place against the solid masculine world of my cabin. I saw the dark, ugly bruises on her shins and the raw, bleeding scrapes on her feet. Someone had chased her, or she was running from something truly terrible. People don't run barefoot into a mountain blizzard without a powerful reason. "Sit," I said, gesturing with my chin toward the wooden bench by the fire. She didn't move. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, shifted to me. They were filled with weariness, yes, but also a defiant pride. She wasn't begging. She had come here as a last resort, and she was daring me to throw her back out. I ignored her defiance. I took the kettle from the hearth hook, poured the last of my coffee into a tin mug, and set it on the table. "It's warm. Drink it." She moved then, a slow, stiff shuffle to the table. She picked up the cup with both hands, and I saw her knuckles were scraped raw. She drank in small, measured sips, her eyes never leaving the fire. She drank like someone who hadn't had a warm drink in days, maybe weeks. "You hungry?" I asked. She hesitated, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I took down a loaf of sourdough bread I'd baked 2 days prior, sliced off a thick piece, and put it on a tin plate with a chunk of cold venison. I slid it across the table toward her. She sat on the edge of the bench, her back ramrod straight, and ate with a slow, deliberate purpose. Every bite was calculated, every chew savored. It was the eating of a survivor. I leaned against the far wall, my arms crossed, watching her. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? Who was she running from? I knew better than to ask. You don't ask questions of a cornered animal. You give it space. You let it see you're not a threat. When she finished, she placed the plate neatly back on the table and stared into the fire again. Her hands were tucked under her legs, trying to absorb the heat. "You came a long way," I said, more a statement than a question. She was silent for a long time. I thought she wouldn't answer. Then her voice came soft and raspy, the words shaped by an accent I couldn't quite place. It was native, but from which tribe I couldn't tell. "Camp," she said. "Far." Then she added, her voice dropping lower. "Not go back." My jaw tightened. I'd heard stories. Women cast out for imagined slights, for refusing a brutish husband, or for reasons no sane person could fathom. Whatever had happened, her camp had chosen to let the winter decide her fate. "You can stay the night," I said. The words felt heavy, consequential. I had just broken the first rule of my self-imposed exile. I had let the world in, Her eyes flickered to mine a quick searching glance before returning to the flames. She gave another one of those single sharp nods. I pulled a heavy wool blanket from the foot of my bed and laid it on the bench beside her. She didn't thank me, but she immediately pulled it around her shoulders, huddling deep within its folds. For the first time, I saw some of the tension leave her body. We sat like that for what must have been an hour in a silence broken only by the crackling fire and the muffled rage of the storm outside. I stayed at the table watching her from the corner of my eye. I saw the way her shoulders finally began to unhunch as the deep cold started to recede from her bones. I felt something shift inside me, a strange and unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a stark, jarring awareness. This woman, this stranger with her silent suffering and fierce pride, had in a few short hours made my cabin feel less like a place I was hiding from the world and more like a shelter that actually mattered. The fire I tended wasn't just for me anymore. The fire had burned down to a deep, mesmerizing bed of embers, casting the cabin in a soft crimson glow that softened the hard edges of my world. I remained at the table, my elbows resting on the wood, my hands clasped together. My thoughts, usually a quiet, orderly procession, were in turmoil. Across the room, she sat huddled on the bench, the wool blanket wrapped so tightly around her, she looked like a small, bundled child. She hadn't moved since finishing the meal, her gaze still lost in the dying flames. Her presence had fundamentally altered the space. For 5 years, this cabin had been an extension of myself, silent, solitary, ordered. Now the simple, rhythmic sound of her breathing filled the void I hadn't even realized was there. "You must have walked for days," I said quietly, my voice startling me in the stillness. I wasn't looking at her, just at the patterns in the wood grain of the table. She stirred, pulling the blanket closer. A long moment passed before she answered, her voice still raspy. 3 nights. No fire. I turned my head to look at her then. Her face was impassive as she said it, but the stark reality of her words hit me like a physical blow. 3 nights in a blizzard like this without shelter or fire. It was a miracle she was alive. I could see the faint purplish bruises on her shins and the cracked, dry skin of her lips. She was tougher than she looked. Far tougher. "Why?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "Why did you leave?" Her fingers tightened on the blanket's edge. The silence stretched, and I regretted asking. It was none of my business. Just as I was about to tell her to forget it, she spoke, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "They say I take knife to a man." She paused, and her eyes, glittering in the ember light, lifted to meet mine. It was a challenge, a test. "He grabbed me," she finished. My jaw tightened again, a familiar knot of anger rising in my chest. Not at her, but at the faceless man, at a world that allowed such things to happen. "Did you?" I asked, my voice as flat as hers. I needed to know. "Yes," she said without hesitation. Then after a beat, "He lives." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That was all I needed to hear. I'd seen enough of so-called justice on the frontier to know that a woman's word, especially a native woman's, was worth less than dust against a man's pride. "You're safe here," I said, and I meant it. The words felt like a vow. I saw her shoulders relax a fraction, a barely perceptible easing of the tension that held her ramrod straight. It was enough. She shifted on the bench, reaching down to her leg where the deerskin was torn. I took the kettle from the hearth hook, poured the last of my coffee into a tin mug, and set it on the table. "It's warm. Drink it." She moved then, a slow, stiff shuffle to the table. She picked up the cup with both hands, and I saw her knuckles were scraped raw. She drank in small, measured sips, her eyes never leaving the fire. She drank like someone who hadn't had a warm drink in days, maybe weeks. "You hungry?" I asked. She hesitated, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I stood and ladled water from the barrel near the door into the small basin I used for washing. I handed her a clean cloth and stepped back, turning toward the fire to give her some privacy. I heard the soft sounds of splashing water. She was methodical, quiet. When I glanced back, she was washing her face and arms. The grime ran off her in streaks, revealing paler skin underneath. The water in the basin was nearly black when she finished. Or she was running from something truly terrible. People don't run barefoot into a mountain blizzard without a powerful reason. "Sit," I said, gesturing with my chin toward the wooden bench by the fire. She didn't move. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, shifted to me. They were filled with weariness, yes, but also a defiant pride. She wasn't begging. She had come here as a last resort, and she was daring me to throw her back out. I ignored her defiance. I was inviting a world of trouble to my doorstep. Then I thought of her huddled by my fire and of the raw wounds on her feet. The trouble didn't matter. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd sent her back out into that. It was as simple and as complicated as that. When I came back inside and barred the door, she was on the bench again, the blanket slipping from one shoulder. Her damp skin shone in the firelight. "You can sleep there," I said, nodding toward the bench. "I'll keep the fire going." She looked at the bench, then at me, her eyes questioning. "You not? Send me out." "No," I said, my voice steady and certain. "Not tonight. Not in this storm." Her dark eyes held mine for a long moment, searching for the lie, for the hidden price. Whatever she saw or didn't see seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once and then lay down on the hard bench, curling into a tight ball on her side, her back to me. I went back to my chair at the table, listening as her breathing gradually slowed and deepened. The sound was a soft counterpoint to the howl of the wind, a fragile sign of life in the vast emptiness. I stayed awake for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her shoulders under the blanket, the firelight painting her in hues of gold and amber. The wind rattled the shutters, and she stirred in her sleep, a soft moan escaping her lips. She pulled the blanket tighter without waking. I got up, crossed the room, and gently adjusted the blanket, making sure it covered her completely. I stood there for a moment, looking down at her. The smallness of her hands, the elegant curve of her cheek pressed against the rough wood of the bench. A wave of protectiveness washed over me, so fierce and unexpected it almost staggered me. It had been so long since I'd felt responsible for another person's well-being. So long since I'd cared. I added another log to the fire, watching the new flames lick at the seasoned wood. I didn't go back to the table. I pulled my chair closer to the hearth and sat there, a silent guardian in the dim light. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, a sound pulled me from a light doze. It was a whimper, a pained, frightened sound. I looked toward the bench and saw her thrashing in her sleep, her face contorted in a silent scream, one hand clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeline, a nightmare. Given what she'd been through, I wasn't surprised. I moved to her side, kneeling on the cold floorboards beside the bench. I didn't touch her, not wanting to startle her further. "You're all right," I said quietly, my voice low and calm. "You're safe." Her eyes flew open wide and wild with terror, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. For a split second, she looked straight through me, still trapped in the horror of her dream. Then her eyes focused, and she saw me kneeling there. Her body went rigid, a new kind of fear replacing the old one. I stayed perfectly still, letting her see that I meant no harm. "It's just me," I whispered. "Elias, you're in my cabin. You're safe." Slowly, the panic receded from her eyes. She let out a long, shuddering breath and closed her eyes again, though her body remained tense. I stayed there for a while longer, watching until her breathing evened out and the lines of fear on her face softened. Then I stood and went back to my chair. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat by the fire, the Winchester across my lap, and listened. I listened to her breathing, to the storm, and to the unfamiliar beating of my own heart. When the first hint of gray dawn filtered through the gaps in the shutters, I was still there. The woman stirred, then sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders like a shield. The first question in her eyes was for me. "You go now?" she asked, her voice raspy from sleep. I looked at the window where the snow was still falling thick and heavy. The world outside was a wall of white. "Not yet," I said, getting to my feet. "Coffee first." I poured 2 cups from the fresh pot I just brewed and set one on the table in front of her. She took it with both hands, the warmth a welcome balm. Her eyes stayed on me as she drank, and I could feel her weighing me, judging me, trying to decide if the safety I offered was real. And in that quiet moment, watching the dawn struggle to break through the storm, I knew I wasn't going to tell her to leave. Not today, and maybe not the day after either. Something had broken in my solitude, and I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to fix it. The storm finally broke by mid-morning, leaving behind a world transformed. The sun, when it appeared, was a pale, watery disk in a sky of brilliant, aching blue. The light reflecting off the fresh snow was so bright it hurt the eyes. The world outside was silent, muffled, and utterly still. It was a beautiful, lethal landscape. I spent the morning clearing a path to the lean-to and the woodpile, the work warming my blood and clearing my head. Time for a proper meal. She watched me as I worked, her attention focused and intense. It was as if she were trying to learn the rhythm of my life, the way I moved about the small space, the purpose behind each action. I was conscious of her scrutiny, and I found myself moving with a deliberate care I didn't usually possess, as if I were trying to prove something to her, though. What it was I couldn't say. When I set a steaming bowl of beans and salt pork in front of her, she ate with the same quiet intensity as the night before, but this time she met my gaze across the table. "You have a name?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She looked at me, a flicker of that old wariness in her eyes. A name was a piece of herself, a thing that could be owned or used against her. After a long pause, she nodded once. "Lena," she said. The name was a soft exhalation, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Lena," I repeated, trying the sound of it. It felt strange to say another person's name in this cabin after so long. "I'm Elias Thorne. Folks just call me Elias." She didn't repeat my name. She just gave a slight nod and went back to her meal. I didn't push. After we ate, I pulled on my heavy coat. "I've got to check the north fence line," I told her. "The weight of the snow can bring down the wire. The cattle will find any gap." Lena's brow furrowed slightly, a clear sign she didn't understand all the words. I gestured toward the door. "Fence," I repeated, then made a walking motion with my fingers and pointed north. Her expression cleared. She nodded and glanced toward the bench. A silent question. "Should I wait here?" "You can stay inside," I said. "Keep the fire fed. It'll be warm." I strapped on my snowshoes, the creak of the leather bindings loud in the pristine silence. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me clean and sharp. I squinted at the horizon, half expecting to see dark figures moving against the white men from her camp. But there was nothing. Just miles of unbroken snow, the distant mountains shimmering like jagged glass. The fence line was a long, hard walk. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the work of checking the posts and tightening the wire was grueling. But the physical exertion was a relief. It kept my mind from circling back to the woman in my cabin. Even so, as I worked, my thoughts kept drifting. To the quiet dignity in her posture, to the resilience in her eyes, to the simple, unexpected sound of her name. It was late afternoon by the time I returned, tired and cold to the bone. The sun was already dipping low, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. I stopped dead about 50 yards from the cabin. Lena was outside. She had set the blanket aside and was crouched by the woodpile, her deerskin dress a dark shape against the snow. She was attempting to stack the kindling I'd split yesterday. Her movements were clumsy, her hands obviously numb with cold, but she was working with a fierce determination. I walked over slowly, my snowshoes making soft crunching sounds. "I didn't tell you to do that." She looked up, her cheeks flushed with the cold, her breath misting in the air. She looked back at the wood. "I help," she said simply. The two words struck me with surprising force. "I help." It wasn't a plea or a bargain. It was a statement of fact, of her own value. I crouched beside her. "Here," I said, taking the small hatchet from the chopping block. "Like this. Shorter, finer pieces for starting the fire." I showed her how to brace the wood and strike it with short, controlled blows. She watched my hands, her focus absolute. Then she took the hatchet and tried herself. Her grip was awkward, but she didn't give up. The blade bit into the wood, splitting it unevenly, but she persisted until a neat pile of kindling lay beside her. I said nothing, but I felt a knot of something I hadn't even been aware of begin to loosen in my chest. There was a strange, unexpected comfort in sharing this space and the simple act of working alongside another person. Later, after I'd filled the water buckets from the well, I came inside to find her sweeping the floor with my short-handled broom. She had taken the task upon herself, her expression calm and focused. The fringe of her torn dress swayed with her movements. "You don't have to do all that," I said, feeling an odd need to protest to maintain the old order of things. Lena straightened up, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "I stay, I work," she said. Her tone was not defiant, but matter-of-fact. It was the code of the frontier, a principle I lived by myself. I nodded slowly. Fair enough. That evening, the cabin was cleaner than it had been in years, and smelled of fresh wood smoke. We ate another simple meal. The silence was still there, but it was changing. It felt less like an absence and more like a shared space. "Will anyone come looking for you?" I asked when the quiet stretched too long. Lena's hand stilled over her plate. Her jaw worked for a moment before she answered. "Maybe, but I will not go back." I studied her face for a long moment. I saw the fear she was trying to hide, but underneath it a core of unbending resolve. "If they come here," I said, the words coming out before I'd consciously formed them, "I'll deal with it." Her eyes shot up to mine wide and searching, looking for any sign of doubt or insincerity. Whatever she saw there must have been enough, because she gave a single solid nod and returned to her meal. As the sun disappeared, completely casting the world into a deep, velvety darkness, I went outside to bring in more wood for the night. When I came back in, she was standing by the fire, her back to me, warming her hands. The blanket had slipped, revealing the elegant line of her neck and the sharp curve of her collarbone in the flickering light. I set the logs down with a thud that was louder than I intended. I turned away abruptly, busying myself with the stove, a sudden unfamiliar heat rising in my own chest. Later, as I banked the fire to keep it going through the night, she sat on the bench, her legs tucked beneath her, watching me from under her long lashes. "You can stay tomorrow," I said, not looking at her, not entirely sure why I was saying it. Her face remained unreadable for a moment, then it softened just a fraction. "If you let me." I nodded once. "Then stay." It was the last thing either of us said that night. She lay down on the bench and turned toward the fire. I sat back in my chair, listening to the wind pick up again, a low moan in the chimney. And for the first time in 5 long years, my cabin didn't feel empty. It just felt quiet. Night fell like a thick black curtain, turning the cabin into a small island of flickering light in an ocean of frozen darkness. The fire burned with a steady, hypnotic pulse. I sat at the table, methodically cleaning my Winchester. The familiar weight of the rifle, the scent of gun oil, the rhythmic slide of the cleaning rod through the barrel. It was a ritual that calmed the disquiet in my soul. It was something to do with my hands, a way to keep my thoughts from circling too obsessively around the woman lying on the bench not 10 feet away. Lena had pulled the blanket over herself, but she hadn't fallen asleep. I could tell by the stillness of her body, the controlled rhythm of her breathing. She lay on her side, facing the fire, her dark hair a stark cascade against the rough wool. The deerskin dress had slipped at her shoulder again, and the firelight kissed the curve of her skin. She seemed oblivious, or perhaps she simply didn't care. But I noticed. Lord, I noticed. I kept my head down, focusing on the intricate mechanics of the rifle's lever action. But my eyes kept betraying me, drifting toward her still form. I hadn't planned on this. My plan, if you could call it that, had been simple: give her shelter from the storm, a meal, and then come morning send her on her way. But the storm had passed, a new day had come and gone, and she was still here. She was sweeping my floor, stacking my kindling, and moving through my solitude as if she had a right to be there. And the most unsettling part was I didn't want her to leave. I finished reassembling the rifle, the click of the final piece sliding into place unnaturally loud in the silence. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Are you certain no one followed you?" I asked, my voice low. A long moment passed. Then Lena opened her eyes and turned her head just enough to look at me. "No one," she said, her voice a quiet murmur. "I walk in storm. No tracks." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if that eased my mind or not. A lack of tracks wouldn't stop men who were determined. "If anyone does come looking," I said, "you tell me. Before they get close." Her brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. It was clear she wasn't used to anyone offering to stand with her. After a moment, she gave a slight nod. "I tell you." I leaned back in my chair, stretching my legs toward the warmth of the fire. "What's your plan? After this, you aim to keep moving?" Her face tightened at the question, the brief moment of ease vanishing. "No place to go," she said, her voice barely audible. "If I go back, they beat me. Maybe worse." My jaw clenched so hard I felt a muscle jump. I'd seen enough of the world's casual brutality to know she wasn't exaggerating. I thought of Sarah, of how I would have torn the world apart to keep anyone from laying a hand on her. A cold, hard rage settled in my gut. "Then you'll stay," I said simply. It wasn't an offer anymore. It was a declaration. She blinked, her dark eyes wide in the firelight. It was clearly not the answer she had expected. "As long as you pull your weight," I added, softening the intensity of my tone. "And as long as you want to." There was a long pause. I could almost see her turning the words over in her mind, testing their weight, searching for the catch. Finally, she nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. A hint of something, relief, maybe, softened the harsh lines of her face before she turned back toward the fire. I tossed another log on the flames, and the sudden flare-up illuminated her profile. The high cheekbone, the straight nose, the strength in the line of her jaw. She was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that both drew me in and made me deeply uneasy. I sat back down, the weight of my decision settling over me. I had been alone for so long that I wasn't sure I remembered how to share my space, my life, with another person. especially one like her, so wounded and yet so proud, watching my every move as if waiting for the moment I would inevitably betray her trust. After a while, her breathing deepened and I thought she had finally fallen asleep. But then she stirred and sat up, pushing the blanket from her shoulders. "Too warm," she murmured, more to herself than to me. My gaze fell on her before I could stop it. The deerskin dress in the heat of the cabin hung loosely on her frame. The torn neckline gaped open, showing the delicate line of her collarbone, and just below it the dark, ugly shadow of a bruise on her upper arm. My eyes shot back to the fire, a hot wave of guilt and anger washing over me. Guilt for looking, and a white-hot anger at the man who had put that mark on her. "Who hurt you?" The question was out before I could censor it, my voice a low growl. She didn't answer at first. I could feel her stillness across the room. Then, in a voice as flat and cold as a river stone, she said, "The man from camp. The one I cut." My hands curled into fists on the table. I didn't press her for details. I didn't need them. The story was written in the bruises on her skin and the haunted look in her eyes. I just nodded once my gaze fixed on the flames. "He won't touch you again. Not here." Something in her expression shifted. It was like watching a wall built of stone and ice develop the smallest of cracks. "You mean that?" she whispered. It wasn't a question. "I mean it." She looked at me for a long, silent moment, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Then she lay back down. But this time she faced me, not the fire. I stayed at the table a little longer, but the calm I sought from cleaning my rifle was gone. The room felt charged, intimate, warmer than the fire alone could account for. Finally, I stoked the fire one last time and leaned the Winchester back in its place against the wall. When I turned, her eyes were still on me, her face unreadable in the half-light. "Why you live alone?" she asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard, striking a nerve I thought was long dead. I hadn't spoken of it in years, but in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, with no one else to hear the truth, felt less heavy. "My wife died," I said, the words feeling rough and foreign in my throat. "Years back, during the war." I swallowed hard. Didn't have much use for people after that. Her gaze softened, a flicker of empathy warming her dark eyes. "You still love her?" The simple, direct statement hit me harder than a physical blow. I couldn't speak for a moment. I just nodded, the movement stiff and painful. "Yeah, I do." She held my gaze for another moment, then turned her head toward the fire again. "Then you are a good man, Elias Thorne." I didn't know what to say to that. No one had called me a good man in a very long time, and I wasn't sure I deserved the title. So I just sat back down, letting the silence settle between us again. Only this time it was a different kind of silence. It was filled with shared sorrow and a nascent, fragile understanding. After a long while, her breathing finally evened out, her face relaxing in sleep. I stayed where I was, watching over her until the fire burned low and my own eyelids grew heavy. I wasn't sure when I dozed off, but a sound woke me in the dead of night, a soft, quick gasp like a breath caught in fear. I looked over and saw her turning in her sleep, her hand clutching the edge of the bench, her face tight with some inner turmoil. I rose without a sound, crossed the room, and crouched beside her again. "It's all right," I whispered, my voice a low rumble. "You're safe." Her eyes flew open wide and disoriented in the dim glow of the embers. She flinched when she saw me, a raw, instinctive reaction. But then recognition dawned and she went still. I didn't move, letting her see I wasn't a threat. Slowly her breathing calmed and her hand released its death grip on the bench. "You're safe," I said again, my voice quiet but firm. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement in the gloom, and then lay back down. I stayed crouched there for a moment longer, the cold of the floorboards seeping through my trousers. Then I stood and returned to my chair. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I watched the embers die and the shadows lengthen. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the cabin didn't feel empty when the sun came up. It felt occupied, and the thought didn't bring the resentment I would have expected. It brought a strange, unsettling sense of peace. The next morning broke clear and cold, the kind of day where the air itself feels brittle. A layer of frost coated the inside of the window pane, turning the world outside into a blurred watercolor of white and blue. I'd been up since before first light, moving with a quietness I didn't know I possessed. Lena stirred on the bench just as the aroma of coffee began to fill the cabin. She sat up, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her hair was a glorious, sleep-tousled mess, but her eyes were clear and alert. She watched me as if to reassure herself that the night had been real, that I was still the same man. "Did you sleep?" I asked, without turning from the stove. She nodded. "Better." That one word and the lack of fear behind it settled something deep in my chest. I served up 2 plates of fried venison and sourdough toast. We ate in a silence that was becoming less a void and more a comfortable space between us. After breakfast, I shrugged into my coat. There's work to be done. Splitting wood for the next storm. Lena rose as well, setting her plate aside. I help. I hesitated. The thought of her wielding a heavy splitting axe was unnerving. All right, I said finally. But watch your feet. That axe doesn't know the difference between a log and a toe. Outside, the air was so cold it stung the inside of my lungs. I set a thick round of pine on the chopping block and brought the axe down with a clean, satisfying thwack, splitting it in 2. Lena stood nearby, the wool blanket wrapped around her, watching my every move with an intense focus. We fell into a rhythm. I'd swing the axe and she would step forward to gather the split pieces, stacking them in neat rows against the cabin wall. After a while, the blanket became a hindrance. She let it fall to the snow and worked with her bare arms exposed to the biting air. The deerskin dress, frayed and worn, moved with her as she bent and straightened, and I found myself catching my breath more than once at the fluid grace of her movements. I forced my attention back to the axe, the rhythmic work a necessary distraction from the unwelcome warmth spreading through my chest. Around mid-morning, I paused, resting the axe head on the block to catch my breath. As I straightened up, I saw Lena looking past me, her body suddenly tense, her face a mask of alarm. "What is it?" I asked, my voice sharp. She didn't answer at first. She just raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the distant tree-lined ridge to the south. "Riders." She whispered the word, a puff of white in the frigid air. I turned my eyes, scanning the horizon. At first I saw nothing but snow and trees. Then I caught a flicker of movement. 2 dark figures on horseback, moving slowly, deliberately, their forms stark against the blinding white. My blood ran cold. My jaw tightened, and the soldier inside me, the one I'd tried so hard to bury, took over. Inside, I said, my voice low and hard. I was already moving, grabbing the Winchester from where it leaned against the wall. "Now, and stay away from the window." Lena didn't hesitate. She scrambled inside the cabin, her face pale with a terror that was all too familiar. I didn't follow her. I stood my ground by the woodpile, the rifle held loosely in my hands, its weight a cold comfort. I watched as the riders drew closer, their progress slow but steady through the deep snow. When they were near enough for me to make them out, I saw they were 2 native men, hard-faced and grim. They wore thick buffalo robes and both had rifles resting in scabbards on their saddles. They looked like they meant business. They pulled their horses to a halt at the edge of the cleared space around my cabin about 30 yards out. Their eyes took in everything, the cabin, the lean to me. Morning, one of them called out, his voice flat. He didn't bother with a friendly tip of the hat. "Morning," I replied, my tone just as flat. I didn't move a muscle. "We're looking for a woman," the man said, getting straight to the point. "From our camp. She came this way." He described Lena, his words clipped and harsh. "You seen her?" I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, let them feel the cold in my resolve. "Can't say that I have," I said evenly. The man's eyes narrowed, sliding past me to the cabin door. "You mind if we take a look around your property? She might be hurt hiding." "I do mind," I said. My voice didn't rise, but my grip on the Winchester tightened. The message was clear. The second man, who had been silent until now, shifted in his saddle. "We ain't looking for trouble, mister. She belongs to a man back at our camp. We're just here to take her back." The casual ownership in his voice, the phrase, "belongs to a man," ignited the cold rage in my gut into a hot fire. I took a deliberate step forward, positioning myself squarely between them and my cabin door. "She's not here," I said, my voice hardening into granite. "You've asked your question. Now you can ride on." The first man's hand drifted down, resting on the stock of his rifle. For a long, heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to push it. The air crackled with tension. It was just like a dozen moments from the war, the split second before the killing starts. I sighted down the barrel of my Winchester, centering it on his chest. He saw the movement. He saw the look in my eyes. He glanced at my rifle, then back at my face. And whatever he saw there made him reconsider. "Fine," he spat, pulling his hand away from his weapon. He yanked on his horse's reins, turning the animal sharply. "If you see her, you tell her. Her people are looking for her." They rode off the way they came, their backs stiff with anger. I didn't lower the rifle. I watched them until they were nothing but 2 small dots disappearing into the trees. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. When I stepped back inside, the warmth of the cabin felt like a different world. Lena was standing by the hearth, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. She was trembling. "They will come back," she said. It wasn't a question. Maybe, I admitted, leaning the rifle back in its place. The adrenaline was starting to recede, leaving me feeling strangely hollow. "But they won't take you from here." She looked at me then, her eyes wide and searching, filled with a raw, desperate hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Why you do this?" I shrugged, unable to voice the complex storm of emotions inside me. The memory of Sarah, the ghosts of the war, the simple, undeniable fact of Lena's courage. "Because you're under my roof," I said, the words feeling inadequate but true, "and I don't give up what's mine to men like that." I hadn't realized what I'd said until the words were already out. "What's mine?" Something in her face shifted, a storm of emotions crossing her features. Shock, disbelief, and then something else. Something deeper. She moved toward me, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, until she stood so close I could feel the heat radiating from her body. "You mean that?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I mean it," I said, my own voice hoarse. We stood there for a long moment, the world shrinking to the space between us. The danger outside had forged something new inside. Then slowly she raised a trembling hand and rested it flat against my chest, right over my heart. I went utterly still, every muscle in my body tensing. I could feel the frantic beating of my own heart against her palm. She didn't say another word. She just held her hand there, a silent acknowledgement, a transfer of trust that was more powerful than any words could ever be. Finally, she let her hand drop and stepped back, sitting on the bench as if her legs could no longer support her. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The confrontation had been draining, but this moment, this quiet, profound connection, had shaken me to my very core. I poured 2 cups of water from the bucket, my hands unsteady. I handed one to her and sat at the table across from her. "You can stay," I said again, my voice quiet but certain. "For as long as you want." A small, hesitant smile touched her lips for the first time. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. "Then I stay." That night, after a supper eaten in a silence that was now rich with unspoken understanding, I banked the fire high, determined to keep the cold and the darkness at bay. Lena lay down on the bench, but this time when she looked at me there was no fear in her eyes. There was only a deep, weary gratitude. And when I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep in my chair, it was the first time in 5 years that I didn't feel like I was completely alone in the world. I had someone to protect, and that, I realized with a startling clarity, made all the difference.